Okay. All right. Okay, so this is work that I did with Emery Berger at UMass Amherst and Ben Zorn at Microsoft Research. And before I get too far with this, I just want to say, yes, we call this ExceLint, but it's actually not a linter at all. It's actually a kind of a totally different thing. But because of our good taste in names, it was a name we just couldn't resist. We were awarded an extra badge. I just want to sort of say that it's not a linter, and in fact, it's a tool that finds bugs with high precision and recall. Okay, so as I alluded to before, this is about finding bugs in spreadsheets. We worked with Excel in particular. The reason why we're looking at this is because many non-programmers use Excel to solve a lot of real problems. So, for example, journalists use Microsoft Excel to solve a lot of their data problems. Scientists use it, politicians use it, business people use it. And for all these people, their time is important and their mistakes are costly. So this is an important domain. And I should also point out that the number of people who use Excel is enormous, right? That number there, the 750 million, that's Microsoft's conservative estimate based on the number of people who actually buy and install Excel. And these other numbers here are based on a Stack Overflow poll. Basically, there's roughly 20 million professional programmers in the world. So you can see there are way more Excel users. Okay. Let me just point out that few of these people actually consider themselves to be programmers. Okay. So because so many people use it, and they use it in important domains, that means that some of these bugs can actually be quite catastrophic. So here's a story about basically a problem that arose in biology, where people were using Excel to basically solve kind of genomics problems, and it turns out that roughly 1 in 5 of the papers published that use Excel actually had the wrong result because of a bug. It turns out that the London whale, which was this sort of shady investment strategy, went kind of awry because of a programming error in Excel. They were actually doing their modeling in Excel. And then there's this other spreadsheet that I'll come back to in a little bit, but basically there was an economics paper done by some professors at Harvard. Their analysis was highly influential in the political world, and it turns out that they were totally wrong, and again, it was because of a small set of programming errors. Okay, so if we can automatically find spreadsheet errors, then we can have a pretty big impact on a lot of people. All right, so ExceLint is a tool that finds spreadsheet errors automatically. It's a plugin for Microsoft Excel, and it has 2 pieces. The first piece is a visualization that we call the global view, and the second part is a tool called the proposed fix tool. So I'm going to walk through both of these to give you an intuition for the kinds of things it finds. Okay, so since this tool is for non-programmers, it has a sort of a simple interface with 4 buttons. And if you want to run the global view, which is what I'll start with, then you click on this button here. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to show this to you by way of some examples. So a rogues gallery, if you will, of some pretty bad spreadsheets. Okay, so here's the first one. And this is kind of your typical view of a spreadsheet. There's nothing obviously wrong with this. It looks sort of benign. But it turns out that if you run the global view on it, you get this totally different view. And so here's the intuition here. Basically, each color represents a different class of formula. And I'll come back to this in a little bit, what these colors actually mean. But you can see that once you dig down a little bit deeper, the spreadsheet's actually a little bit of a mess. Okay, so here's one of the bugs. So the bug is the thing all the way to the right. And what this little formula is doing is it's summing all of these things in this row, but it's actually an off by 1 error, right? It's summing everything in the row just below it. It should be summing the things just to the left. Okay. Now, it turns out just below it there's another class of bug, and this is an off by 2 error, which I understand. Those are hard to find. You don't learn about off by 2 errors in computer science school. So, right. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of these on this spreadsheet. Okay, so here's another spreadsheet that's looks sort of benign, and it tracks particulate matter in the air or something. And if you run the tool, you get this visualization. And you can see right away at the bottom right corner here, there's this blue cell. It looks different than all the other ones. And if you dig into the reason why it looks different, the reason is that it's summing these things, it's averaging these things above it, and it's actually missing, it's omitting a cell. The cell all the way up at the top, it misses. Okay. So here's one more. And if you take a look at this one, right, with the global view, two cells kind of pop out right away in this sort of angry pink color. And what this one is doing is this cell is summing the things above it. But if you look at what the computation is supposed to do in that neighborhood, it's actually supposed to sum the things below it. So this one just totally does the wrong thing. Okay, so that's the global view. It's this nice visualization. And one thing we wanted to do was, the global view just sort of shows you the structure of the spreadsheet, but it doesn't actually tell you if things are bugs. That's sort of up to you. So we wanted to capture some of the intuition that goes into humans looking at that visualization and automatically, seeing those things and turn it into a bug that actually, a tool that actually just walks you through the suspected errors. So this is called the Propose Fix tool. And you run it by clicking this audit button. And when you run it, it shows you two things. So first, it flags a suspected error in red. And then what it says, this sort of green region, is what it's saying is the thing that you flagged in red should look more like the things in green. And in fact, when we looked at that error before, that's exactly what should have happened. That red cell should have been like those other ones. And you can keep going through this, clicking the next cell and finding the next set of errors. And in this case, the very next thing it finds is this, which is the other error in that spreadsheet. Okay, so that's the Propose Fix tool. So by the way, Excel has a built-in error finder. And maybe you've noticed these little green triangles before. What that means is Excel thinks that this is an error, and this is obviously an error, right? Because the correct answer is 42, right? But anyway. And so how does Excel's error finder work? Well, the way that it works is it's basically a bunch of patterns that the Excel developers believed were indicative of bugs. So these are ad hoc patterns, right? And in the SE community, there's a name for this. There's a variety of this sort of an area of research where people are looking for patterns, and they call them smells. Okay, so it turns out that ad hoc patterns are not particularly good at finding errors. And this is actually, the spreadsheet we're just looking at is a really nice example. So the actual bug is this thing that I've circled here, but if you look at where all the green triangles are, actually all of the green triangles except for one are false positives. It doesn't flag the other error. So in a way, you almost want to do the opposite of what this tool says, at least for the spreadsheet. Okay. So instead of ad hoc patterns, ExceLint uses a principled information-theoretic approach. So how does it find formula errors? Let me just kind of enumerate some challenges here. Right, so spreadsheets are really different in terms of a programming language than other languages you've seen. So there are no specifications of any kind. Users just write what they want. It's sort of a free-form environment. There are no tests, right? There's no testing framework for Excel, and people probably wouldn't use them anyway. And then lastly, there's nothing obviously wrong with a lot of the programs, right? There's no type checker or anything like that that signals that there's something wrong with your program. Okay, so the idea around how ExceLint works is based on three observations we made. So the first observation is that spreadsheets contain a great deal of repetitive information. And the reason for this is that spreadsheets don't have user-defined functions. So if you want to repeat a calculation, the way that you do it is by copying and pasting. Second observation is that users don't organize their spreadsheets in an arbitrary way. In fact, they organize their spreadsheets into rectangles. And in prior work that I did with Ben on Flash Relate, one of the things we identified was that if you have irregular layouts versus rectangular layouts, it turns out that it's pretty hard to compute things in the irregular form, but it's actually pretty easy to compute things in the rectangular form. And the reason is that Excel has a bunch of affordances that really nudge you in the direction of laying your spreadsheet out in rectangles. So for example, if you want to actually use this nice concise way of summing a bunch of cells, things actually have to be in a column or in a row so that you can use this nice range syntax. Okay. So it turns out that we looked at this. We wanted to ask ourselves how many spreadsheets actually are in these rectangular layouts. And it turns out that more than 90% of spreadsheets that do any computation at all are actually organized into rectangles. Okay, third observation. Many formula errors are actually reference errors, right? And a reference error basically means there's something wrong with the data that you point out, or the reference to the data. So there's kind of three kinds that you can have. You can omit a reference, or you can have a reference that points at the wrong thing, or you could add an extra reference that you don't want, right? So this is kind of a nice, kind of crisp definition of what it means to be wrong, and these are unambiguously wrong errors, right? You can look at them and you say, oh yeah, they did the wrong thing with respect to the references. Okay, so just to summarize, spreadsheets have layouts where formulas are repetitive and are organized rectangularly, right? That's kind of a nice summary of the character of most of the spreadsheets out there. Okay, so ExceLint uses this information to look for surprising deviations, and its hypothesis is that irregular layouts are actually a signal for errors, or they signify errors. But it's not enough to actually look at just kind of this pairwise thing. You can't just look at something unusual and look at its neighbors. You actually have to consider a global context, right, if you want to do this the right way. So in ExceLint, the global context is rectangular regions, right? I just explained why rectangles are important. And so what ExceLint does as one of its steps is it partitions the spreadsheet into rectangles to kind of build up this context so that we can actually ask questions about unusualness. So for example, if you have a spreadsheet and you want to ask for some arbitrary cell, is this surprising in some way, right? Let's say this one. Then you partition the spreadsheet, and now you have enough information about the spreadsheet to answer this. And let me develop this intuition about what I mean for surprising and partitioning and things. Okay, so what do we mean by surprising? Well, there's just actually this really nice sort of formal mathematical framework developed by this guy named Claude Shannon, who's the father of information theory. And the concept is this thing called entropy. And entropy is a proxy for irregularity. And there's this alternate interpretation that works really nicely with ExceLint, which is entropy is basically expected surprises. It's kind of this probabilistic view of what it means to be surprised about something. Okay, so in case you've never used entropy before, let me give you the intuition here, right? If something's regular, it has low entropy. And if it's disordered, it has a high entropy, right? So this is a number, okay? So how do you measure the entropy of a spreadsheet? Well, in order to do that, we need kind of two pieces. First, we need something that we can count. And the second is that we need a procedure for inferring the intended rectangles. Okay, so I'm going to start with something we can count. So every formula has a set of references. A reference is really a kind of vector. And formulated the right way, vectors are position independent. So once we have that, that means that two formulas that compute the same thing have identical vector sets. So given a set of vectors, we can compress them into a single vector. We call this single vector a fingerprint vector. And this fingerprint vector is something that's actually pretty easy to count. Okay, great. And we can do it fast, which is great. All right, second part, we need a procedure for inferring intended rectangles. And our working assumption here is that users are not totally insane. We want to pick the layout that's sort of least surprising, the thing that they would have actually done, and the metric we use here is the one that minimizes entropy. Okay, so if you have this example, and this example contains two non-obvious errors, then if you sort of put this thing in the pipeline, the first thing it does is it computes the fingerprint vectors. And we have fingerprint vectors for all data, strings, and white space. And the algorithm proceeds by basically recursively subdividing the spreadsheet across a split that minimizes the sum total Shannon entropy until the splits contain only equal value fingerprints. So what I mean, we scan across the spreadsheet, right? We compute this value the whole time. And then when we find the split that has the minimum sum total Shannon entropy, that's the split we pick. And then we recurse and do the same thing. Okay, so now, whoops, we have a layout, okay? And if you stop right here and you visualize that, that's essentially what the global view does. But we want to keep going because we want to look for suspected errors in an automatic way. Okay, so we need a procedure. So we did that. Now we want to look for surprises. Okay, so we call these things proposed fixes. And here's how it works. Every pair of rectangles that, when merged, remains rectangular, that's a potential fix. Okay, so if you look at these two, for example, this is not a good potential fix because if you merge them, they're not rectangular, whereas these ones are. Okay, so what is a proposed fix? Well, the idea here is that it mimics the effect of coming up with the right formula fix. You can sort of say if these things were actually the same formula, they followed the same rule, then they would actually have the same fingerprint. We don't actually have to figure out what the code fix is. We just kind of simulate what it would have done. So fixing a formula basically means altering the surprising formula's fingerprint so that every formula in the union has the same vector. Okay. The nice thing about this is that there's an objective measure of whether a fix is good or not. Good fixes reduce the entropy of the spreadsheet. Okay. So using that, we can rank the suspected bugs, threshold them, and return them. For details, see the paper. Okay, so here's our evaluation. We look at three things: precision, speed, and effort. Okay, and because you want to compare it against some existing thing that's out there, we compare it against this tool called Custodies, which is the state-of-the-art smell finder, which, by the way, is a lot better than the one that's built into Excel. So which one finds more errors? So what we did was we used our global view to look at an audit, a corpus that had already been audited by the Custodies folks. And doing that, we actually found 295 more errors than they found the first time around. And the reason is that they kind of pop out in this global view. And on average, it took us about 5 minutes per bug to find them. So I think that's pretty easy. Okay. So the proposed fix tool, as I mentioned before, automates the spatial reasoning task. And so we wanted to see how well that does against Custodies as well. And it turns out that ExceLint is more precise. Right? So it's kind of categorically more precise. It has a median precision of 100%. It has a mean precision of 61. Custodies median precision is 0, unfortunately, for bugs. Now, it's built to find smells, not necessarily bugs. It has a mean precision of 20%. So it's precise. And then lastly, speed. ExceLint and Custodies, it turns out, are both pretty fast. 85% of them are done under 30 seconds. Okay, great. So let me just kind of finish up with this case study. So this is the paper that I alluded to in the beginning, this thing called Growth in a Time of Debt. It argued that the economic growth is stifled when the debt to GDP ratio is high. It was used for evidence in a lot of political circles to justify austerity, for example, and budget cuts. It turns out that this spreadsheet was audited by a bunch of researchers at UMass Amherst. In case you're wondering to work in spreadsheets, the answer is yes, it can actually get you on the Colbert Report, right? Which is kind of awesome. But it took them a year to do this audit, okay? So we wanted to see, can we reproduce their results in our tool, hopefully a little bit faster, and the answer is yes. So here's the top bug from their paper. It turns out it's the very first thing that ExceLint flags. So the red here, the cells in red, basically sum over these cells here. And the cells in green sum over the cells in here. And the interesting thing about that is that the reason why we flag those as red, it turns out the red ones are right, is because they're the smaller number, which actually means that most of this spreadsheet is wrong, which is kind of shocking. Anyway, so that's ExceLint. It's principled, it's fast, precise, easy to use, and you can download it at excelint.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I will use Excel again. Just a quick question. It seems obvious, but many of the spreadsheets have a kind of one column to sum along the rows, and then at the bottom of this column, the total.
Right.
How do you make this not be a bug?
Why doesn't it look weird? Yeah, that's a great question. So it turns out that one of the things that we leverage in ExceLint is the kind of dependence graph. And one thing that we know is that if you're sort of looking down the dependence graph, right, things that depend on other things before it, it's not likely to be a bug because it actually depends on all those things, right? So you kind of expect to go from a lot of data, right, in any computation, a lot of data to kind of a small number of results, and those results are not unusual, right? They're kind of, that's the way computation works. Yeah, good question.
I have a quick question. It seems to me that you actually don't look at the content of the spreadsheet, right? So your technique is actually agnostic to that. It's like a sort of a geometrical or
Right. You mean like the actual contents of the cells?
Yeah. So it could be
that's
numbers
right.
or it could be strings.
That's right. It's totally structural and geometric.
So my question is, like, have you applied this to other domains, or can you envision this technique for other domains?
I think you could. Yeah. I mean, if you can recover, say, dependence graph from something, certainly. You'd have to come up with some intuition for what it means to be geometric or what a layout means, but I think you probably could, yeah.
I guess because it's so geometric, it'll handle things, more advanced features of Excel. It has effectively indirections. You can have H lookups and V lookups,
right,
and other kinds of more complicated ways of getting references.
Mm-hmm.
Does that all work?
Yeah, so that's a good question about things like H lookup and V lookup, right? So the reference behavior of those is actually dynamic, and we don't do any kind of dynamic analysis here. This is strictly a static analysis. So, so there's a potential that we could sort of look into those things, but we don't currently do that.
Have you considered any conditional entropy to measure the user behavior? For example, now it's kind of a global metric for different users, right? If it's possible to customize for different users.
Yeah, that's a good question. Right. So, in a sense, it already does that, right? Because we haven't like learned anything that we transfer from one spreadsheet to another. It really is. It looks at your spreadsheet and it gives you suggestions for your spreadsheet. So I think it does do that. I actually think that the opposite might be a more fruitful thing, because I think many users probably make the same kinds of mistakes. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay, good question though. All right.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.